I will admit this is not the most entertaining of the trainings our office gives. It is relatively dense, and I've copied a lot of it over from regulatory language just so I don't misinterpret anything. So if things do pop up that you have questions about, I am okay answering in the middle of the meeting. Don't feel like you have to remember it until the end. And this is also available through Box and has a few different poll questions and quizzes throughout, and the answers are on the second slide of each of those quiz questions. Um, just don't cheat during this and actually try to answer the questions as we go. So this is covering public health service funded projects, specifically financial conflicts of interest and disclosures. And this is handled by my office, primarily by Lucia. However, I do provide a lot of support and, of course, this training. So this is based on federal regulations, which is not a terribly interesting topic, but it is specifically Federal Regulation 42, Part 50, Subpart F, which is promoting objectivity in research. And this specific regulation applies to any public health service funded research, which for UIS right now doesn't necessarily cover CDC and FDA. We haven't applied for those, but we have seen an uptick in NIH interest. So we want to make sure we get this training out as that grows and increases. Throughout, I also will reference some University of Illinois specific policies that incorporate this regulation, but our policy also incorporates Illinois specific pieces. This will go over who the requirements apply to, what the training and disclosure requirements are, and because it talks about significant financial interests, quite often I'll go over what those are and what those are not. If it does qualify as an SFI, what disclosure requires after it's disclosed, how it's determined if it is considered a financial conflict of interest, how to manage and report if it is a financial conflict of interest, and then what happens if you are out of compliance with the regulations and policies. For any questions, feel free to email our general office contact. Previously, there was a conflict of interest COI specific email. It is not, I don't think Lucia or I have access to it, so emailing to ORA is the best way to get a response. And we are the two that will typically have answers regarding the regulations. So the overarching question, who does the regulation apply to? It is each investigator who plans to participate or is actively participating in that PHS funded research, in this case, NIH. And the definition of investigator is very specific. It is not just the project director. It is not just the principal investigator. It is any person, no matter what their title is, no matter whether they are paid on the grant or not. If they are responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of that research, or are being proposed for that funding, this applies to them. If you are proposing subawards, the compliance responsibilities will flow down to them. Ideally, they have their own FCOI policy that is following federal regulation. However, not every organization does. So when that happens, if we are the prime institution, our policy is what is being followed, and we are responsible for making sure all of the subrecipients follow regulations. So just so the super boring language doesn't drone on and on and on, I have a few scenarios and polls throughout. If you have a co-investigator who helps design the study, but they're not paid from the grant, do these requirements still apply to them? The correct answer is yes. If anyone is responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of the funded research, even if they are not receiving funding, they need to understand the policy, they need to understand the requirements, and they will be responsible for following it. Now that we know who it applies to, what do they need to do? First step, if you are here, you are getting that first step over with. The training is required. This is not the only training that exists. This is a very in-depth UIS specific training, so I do recommend it. But My Disclosures has a training in it. NSF Secure Center has, regulation specific, but not university specific training. And that just needs to be completed prior to actually engaging in the research. And then again, at least every 4 years. Or if we were to change our policy or procedure and it affected the requirements when the investigator is brand new to the institution, or if we were to find out that the investigator is not in compliance with the policy or a management plan. And then the second part is the disclosure of financial interests, significant financial interests. This needs to be done at the proposal stage. This is whenever they are planning to participate in the research. They should be disclosing their significant financial interests, which are called SFIs throughout most of this training. And the part most people don't realize is they need to disclose those of their spouse and those of their dependent children. This is done through the My Disclosure system, through the sponsor-specific questionnaire. A lot of the questions are very similar to the annual report of non-university activities, but it is different. The RNUA is state of Illinois specific, and it has a lot more to do with conflict of commitment and interest, whereas the sponsor-specific questionnaire is federal regulation, and it is looking at significant financial interest with thresholds that are different than the RNUA. So same portal, totally different kind of. When you go into My Disclosures, that report of non-university activities is the first thing you see. You'll see if it's saved when it's been approved. The sponsor-specific questionnaire is when you are looking at federal sponsors that have FCOI requirements. Underneath it, you can see that there is training that you can complete there and see when you completed it if you've done it within the last 4 years. I'll be honest, I don't even remember taking this in 2023. That was a while ago. That was right after, within 6 months of me starting at the university. So it is helpful to do it more often than every 4 years, especially as things get a little more involved or if you are planning on pursuing federal funding. Talked a lot about significant financial interest. What is it? What makes it significant? And this is that dense language that comes directly from the regulations. It is one or more interests of the investigator, as defined earlier, anyone who is involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of the research, and their spouse and dependent children, if it reasonably appears to be related to the investigator's institutional responsibilities. It does not matter if it is not related to the specific research. If it is related to what you do for University of Illinois, it could be significant. If it's related to your research, consultation, teaching, university professional practices, committee membership, or service on panels. Looking at publicly traded entities, if you are receiving remuneration payment from the entity in the 12 months preceding your disclosure, and the value of the remuneration plus equity interest by the date of disclosure, when all added together, is $5,000 or more. So remuneration is salary or payment for services that would not be categorized as salary. And then equity interest includes stock options, or other ownership interest. And if you don't have the exact value, that is measured by fair market value. Publicly traded entity is remuneration and equity added together. Private entities, non-public traded entities, is not added together, it's separate. So remuneration only would be over $5,000, or if there is any equity interest, because privately traded entities have not even more lax, they just have fewer regulations. Any of that equity needs to be disclosed. It doesn't matter if it's $1 or if it gets all the way up to that $5,000 threshold. And then any intellectual property rights and interest becomes significant when you receive income from those rights and interests. Beyond just those financial pieces, investigators are also expected to disclose any reimbursed or sponsored travel specifically related to institutional responsibilities, as it was defined earlier. There are exclusions. It does not apply to reimbursed or sponsored travel that comes from a U.S. federal, state, or local government agency, and it does not apply to sponsored and reimbursed travel from domestic U.S. institutions of higher education, an academic teaching hospital, center, or research institute affiliated with a U.S. Institute of Higher Education. And this is, when we say sponsored, we are saying sponsored outside of University of Illinois sponsored projects. Typically, if the university is paying for it, you're doing your expense reports. Not even typically, you don't have to include that in your disclosure. We already have that information. This is if you are being privately reimbursed or sponsored, or it's going through somewhere outside of the university. And it does not apply to your personal travel. These are things related to your institutional responsibilities. And when you disclose it, it needs to include the purpose of the trip, who is sponsoring or organizing the reimbursement or sponsorship, the destination, the estimated cost of travel. I believe we ask within about $1,000, and how long each trip is. When it involves a foreign entity, so you'll notice I specified U.S. Government or U.S. Institute of Higher Education. When it is foreign, the university does require you to upload any sort of supporting documentation, whether you have a contract, a grant, employment, just any sort of affiliation. That's not to say that it is discouraged at all. It's just that it requires a little more paperwork. That is what is a significant financial interest. There are exclusions. So it does not include, obviously, your salary from the University of Illinois. We have that on file. You do not need to disclose it to us if you are an active employee. If you have investment vehicles like mutual funds or retirement accounts, if you don't control the investment decisions, you do not have to report that. If you have income from seminars, lectures, or teaching engagements that are sponsored by U.S. governments or institutes of higher education, or those affiliated with institutions of higher education, those do not count as a significant financial interest, even if it is related to your responsibilities at the university. And when you are on service or advisory committees or review panels that receive income, if it is from or for the U.S. government or the U.S. institutions of higher education, those do not count as a significant financial interest under the regulation that requires disclosure. The long and short of it, because that is a lot of information, if you were to screenshot 2 slides, I would say this one and the next one. Disclose on the sponsor-specific disclosure for yourself, for your spouse, for any dependent children, remuneration and equity, $5,000 or more from public entities, remuneration over $5,000 for private, all equity from private, any remuneration over $5,000 from foreign institutions of higher education or governments, any intellectual property income, any reimbursed or sponsored domestic travel related to university responsibilities, unless it was one of those excluded items, and all reimbursed or sponsored foreign travel related to university responsibilities. You do not need to disclose these on your SSQ, maybe on your RNUA, but not on the sponsor questionnaire. Your university salary, royalties or other payments, any university sponsored projects, the remuneration combined with equity less than $5,000 from those publicly traded entities, any investment from vehicles that you do not directly control, any income from domestic government or domestic institutions of higher education for seminars, lectures, or teaching engagements, remuneration less than $5,000 from those foreign institutions of higher education or foreign governments, or reimbursed or sponsored travel from domestic government agencies or domestic institutes of higher education. And we've got another poll. This is asking which of the following is generally considered a significant financial interest. All right, everybody who answered did get it correct. It is $5,000 in income from publicly traded entities. Now that you know what to disclose, when does it need to be disclosed? When you are, or if you are an investigator, when you plan to participate in the funded research, meaning you are planning to submit a proposal, it needs to be disclosed in the SSQ no later than the time of application. And that is NIH. It also applies if you were to pursue a CDC or an FDA application as well. And then during the period of the award, if you are selected for funding, each investigator needs to submit an updated disclosure at least annually. It is not required at the same time as the RNUA, but I think it's a good rule of thumb just to do it at the same time so you don't have to put anything on your calendar and try to remember. And then in that annual update, if nothing has changed, I believe there's a way to just copy it over, but you should include any information that was not previously disclosed and include updated information for things that were previously disclosed. And then sometimes new financial interests start, are discovered. Maybe you inherited something or you acquire some equity. Just make sure that that is updated within 30 days of either discovering or acquiring that financial interest. Sometimes investigators are added later. When that does happen, make sure that they complete their disclosure upon joining. There is not a specific regulatory timeline for that, but they do need to complete it before they are able to complete any work on the project. As I said earlier, this is done in the My Disclosure system with the sponsor-specific questionnaire. Please make sure, even if you do not have anything that qualifies as a significant financial interest, that you are completing it and choosing no, so that we know it's not that you didn't know the requirement, it's just that you had nothing to disclose. What that looks like when you click on the sponsor-specific questionnaire, it just starts with 2 yes or no questions. The first is, do you have anything to disclose? If you say no, it'll take you toward the end. If you say yes, it will ask you a few more questions. Same with the sponsored or reimbursed travel amounting to $5,000 or more. If you say no, we have that on record that you do not have anything to disclose. But if you say yes, we'll get more details from you. It looks pretty boring to start. You just add the significant financial interest, and that will pop up those extra questions. So it's not too overwhelming at the beginning. It'll ask for the entity name, whoever is providing the payment or is giving the equity. It'll ask where it's based, whether that is outside or within the US, which is a separate question than where you will engage in activities. Some things might be based in the US, but they're having you travel internationally, or it's based internationally, but they're having you work exclusively in the United States. So those are 2 separate questions. And then it will ask if things are supported by a foreign government or entity, whether it is a foreign government talent recruitment program, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It is very different from a malign foreign government talent recruitment program. This is the only one that is completely disallowed by federal regulation, malign, which essentially means shady. There are not great dealings when it comes to malign programs. And then if you have any contracts or written agreements that are not administered by the University of Illinois. A couple of heads ups. There will be extra questions if the entity is based primarily outside of the US. For example, if I say it's happening in Canada, you'll give additional comments there. And another tip or trick, I've seen a lot of errors where people just forget to hit this add button. If it is still in this white search box, it has not been added to your disclosure. Once you hit add, it will show up in a list. Additionally, typing USA or US is not recognized by the portal. You do have to enter United or States, even of, will start showing it. But for whatever reason, US and USA don't work. And if any of these are involved, there are required additional comments. More than likely, it will require a management plan. But like I said, the only one that is a complete cannot be accepted is this malign recruitment program. If you indicate that either the entity is based outside of the United States or you will be conducting activities outside of the United States, this blue heads up will occur that you will have to upload a little bit more information on the ad information page. Ad sponsored travel has some similar questions, but it will be asking specifically about the travel, where the destination of the trip is, how many days of travel, and your estimated cost to the nearest $1,000. The purpose of the trip, instead of having to type it in, you will click which one best applies. If none of them seem to fit, click other and describe what that other purpose is. And same as before, if you indicate that something is happening internationally, just additional documentation is required by federal regulations. Next scenario is about Dr. Lopez, who is a PI on an NIH-funded study. So during her award period, she begins consulting for a biotech company. It is related to her field, and we are assuming her university responsibilities. And with that consultation, she earned $7,500. What should she do? She will need to disclose the first time that income within 30 days of acquiring. And when she does it again annually, that can wait until the annual disclosure cycle, but there isn't a specific disclosure cycle for the SSQ that is related to the RNUA, but it does help just to keep them aligned for your own memory. Right, so our next investigator acquires equity with a privately held company. It is related to their NIH-funded research. Is there a dollar threshold before disclosure is required? And this one could be tricky. Really pay attention to that privately held piece. So because this is privately held, there are not as many regulations to keep private companies in check. There is not a threshold for equity with private companies. So any of that equity does need to be disclosed. That $5,000 threshold is only for payments. Equity is different. If you disclose, who has to determine if it is a conflict? That is determined by my office. We will look and see if the financial interest is reasonably related to one of your research projects, taking into account the nature and extent of your role on the project and the nature and extent of your financial interest. If you have a high role, but it's a relatively low financial interest, it may not be considered reasonably related. And opposite, if you have a high financial interest, but a relatively low role, depending on what your role in the research is, it may potentially be a conflict. What we are looking for, that reasonably related, is if your financial interest could stand to benefit or be affected otherwise by the funded research, or if the interest is in an entity whose financial interest could be affected by the research. My example that really doesn't apply to UIS is if you have interest in a medical manufacturing company or lab, and you are doing a clinical trial on that specific drug. Now there's a potential conflict because you could make money, the entity could make money if the results of that clinical trial look really good. So you have motivation, not saying that you will do it, but there is opportunity to directly and significantly affect the design of the research, the conduct, or the reporting. We just want to make sure that there are things that keep you in check to make sure neither is unnecessarily benefiting or being detrimental if it's a competitor. If we do find that there is a potential for that financial conflict of interest, we will refer you to your unit head, your UEO, and there will be a conflict management plan that needs to be created, reviewed, and approved. just to make sure that there is the separation between responsibilities. What this looks like for us is we will see anyone who has completed the SSQ and has something disclosed. If you disclose nothing, it automatically goes to our completed, and we can say you've done it, you have nothing to disclose. If it is ready for review, we will click on the person's name, and it will show us if it is financially significant and if the activity plans to continue. We will look at the details and then determine, is it reasonably related? If it is, we will request a management plan. That is kind of where we stop at that point, and it goes back to your unit, and you and your unit have that responsibility to create the management plan. If it is not a conflict, or if it didn't actually need reporting in the first place, we will confirm it. Things look good, we have the documentation. If we need more details, if something just needs tweaked, especially if you have multiple disclosures, we can return an individual disclosure. If we know you have equity over 5,000 in a publicly traded entity, we can return the entire disclosure and say, hey, can you add this, and then send it back. We will just do that if the entire disclosure is missing something, not if we just need a slight revision. Hopefully an easier question than some of the other ones I've been asking. Who determines if a financial interest is a financial conflict of interest? It's up to my office. Actually, I believe specifically Lucia, but I do play a supporting role in that. But we will determine if it is reasonably related and constitutes that conflict. If a financial conflict of interest is identified, what is required? So just because there is potential for a conflict does not mean that there is a conflict. We do not require immediate resignation from the project. We don't require an apology, and we don't necessarily require termination of the activity. What we do require is a management plan. We want to encourage you to pursue research and pursue opportunities. We just want to make sure that it is done ethically and that it is managed if it needs to be managed. To manage things, sometimes it's just disclosing it. That can be the end of it. Sometimes there is a specific monitor plan that needs to be conducted. Maybe we need to reduce or eliminate your role in certain parts of the study. Again, going back to our clinical trial with a drug that you help manufacture. Maybe you just don't report. You don't write the reports. You don't have a hand in writing the reports, or you don't touch the data so that you're not accused of tweaking it. It's, making things a little more impartial. And then if it is clinical studies, those do have some other requirements and additional monitoring. Worst case scenario, maybe we do have to eliminate or terminate certain things. We try not to get to that point, but some things just are not able to mesh. These reviews and determinations need to occur before expending funds on the new projects, within 60 days of newly disclosed financial interests, and within 60 days of adding new investigators to the project. Now you've done your part. Now the university needs to do their part. And by university, I mean Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. We then need to submit reports to the sponsor. And these need to be submitted prior to expending funds, whether the conflict is managed, unmanageable, or just unmanaged, within 60 days of identification for an investigator who is new on the project, or within 60 days for newly identified FCOIs for those existing investigators. Once we initiate the report, we then provide status updates at least annually until the project is completed. We do not share these openly. It's on a need to know basis and shared with our office, shared with you or your unit head, and then as required by law or sponsor requirements. What happens if you don't do it? Examples of that are just not being timely with your disclosure. If it is incomplete, there are errors, or if your disclosure is misleading, if you are not completely disclosing information as required, and then if you do have a management plan and you are not following the management plan, those are examples of noncompliance. When noncompliance is identified, the UEO is responsible for implementing a management plan, and they have 60 days to do so. After all of that, with you and your UEO, our office needs to conduct a retrospective review, and we need to look at the non-compliant investigators' research activities to determine if there was bias in the design of the research, the conduct, or the reporting of the results because of that conflict. We have 120 days from determining that noncompliance took place to do that review, since there could be a lot of data we have to comb through. If bias is found, we have to notify the sponsor, and we have to submit a report showing how it's being mitigated, what was the impact of the bias, and what is the plan to eliminate or mitigate the effect of the bias. If it is a clinical research project, there is a requirement for the investigator, and they now have to disclose their conflict in any public presentation on the results of the research going forward, and they have to request an addendum if they publish any presentation on that clinical drug, medical device, or treatment. Not fun. That failure to comply may result in sanctions or administrative actions. It starts with the administrative actions, which are not always severe. I like to assume the best in people, but if it was minor and a mistake, we may just have to delay signing something, or we may just have to temporarily suspend until things get back in compliance. Ideally, if this does happen, which is unfortunate, we are not going to punish you beyond what it takes just to fix the situation. If it cannot be mediated through corrective action, we might have to escalate it to the provost and recommend that sanctions may have to occur in accordance with statutes for the system. And the severity of those sanctions does depend on what the violation was. Like I said, if it's inadvertent, unintentional, and minor, it's probably not going to be a huge sanction. Obviously, there will be consequences, but it would be lesser than if it was on purpose and or major.